Welcome to EdUp Curriculum. I am your host, Nicole Poff, and today I'm really excited. You guys have no idea the amount that has gone into this episode today. This is probably our fourth attempt, possibly. Um, so I just take that as the conversation's going to be really good because someone was trying real hard to make it not happen. But without further ado, today's guest is Michael Forder. Michael, thank you so much for being here. Before we begin, can you introduce yourself? Anything you want to share about your past, current role, what led you to the work you do today?
Sure. And yeah, I appreciate that we've been able to make this happen, after a few hurdles. I was really excited for this opportunity. Yeah, I'm going to talk about this today. So like I said, my name's Michael, whatever we want to go with. I'm currently at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia, and I'm our Director of Learning Experience and Architecture with our Department of Health Professions on a medical campus, but kind of work with all students. I would say, a background kind of helps inform what I do today. Um, I've been in education for 16, 17 years, but I began as a high school teacher, teaching business and marketing and, a variety of classes, selectives, all sorts of kind of coursework that kind of laid the ground for understanding the variances of courses and how different things might stack. I moved into instructional design and kind of faculty support at the high school level, which then eventually led me to higher education and to VCU. In that time, I've been in 4 or 5 different roles at VCU, including working in the sort of IT area, and then working in faculty development, and then moving into curriculum development and program support, and doing some workshops, professional development work along the way, and a little bit of teaching here and there. So I had a real opportunity to kind of see education from all angles. And that's really kind of been in the back of my mind in some of the work that I've done, particularly on looking at curriculum as a whole, but from a student perspective. It's something I'm really passionate about. I'm sure we'll talk about today, is just how students experience their educational time, and not just in one class, but their whole time within it. And sometimes that's outside of what we sort of as instructors think of. We think of individual courses, but students rarely take one course. So that's really where my mindset is, and that kind of informs what I do.
I love it. And that was really kind of the reason I reached out on LinkedIn because I was like, you're doing really cool stuff. We should talk about this. So, what excites you the most about the work you're currently doing?
So I'm working primarily with our Bachelor's of Health Services program. This is a relatively new program, and what I've had the opportunity, really privileged to do, is to it's kind of the gift of time. I've had the opportunity, and was so excited about this role, was to look at our entire curriculum, and look at it closely, and ask questions, and really look at how we could improve the student experience. Where I think so often, in education, you have an extremely limited amount of time to do as best you can, and you're just patching things together. And I've done a lot of that work, and I feel proud of that work, but you often wish you could do more. Um, so when this came up, and this chance to say, well, let's look at everything. Let's look at the experience now that we have a relatively new program, and what how can we take this program and bring it to the next level. I was like, absolutely, I'm in. This is something I would love to do. So it's been exciting to kind of take part in that. Again, at the ground level.
That's so cool. That's like a dream job, honestly. Super cool. When we chatted last week, so we chatted, or maybe a couple weeks ago now, we chatted, there were a couple things that I still continue to think about. One of them was this idea of wellness days. So you mentioned that your program has wellness days, um, which I think we should probably explain what are wellness days, but then what inspired those, and are there any significant impacts yet so far?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this will lead into some of our conversations on data, because this was something that was initiated and kind of we came up with this when I first came on board. And it started with a program retreat and listening to sort of all stakeholders. So, heard from instructors about inconsistencies, sort of in attendance policies. What should we be doing? What do you do versus what do I do? Is there a program policy, which there wasn't? But we also involved our students in that conversation and listening to our students. They had the same concerns. This wasn't a one-sided experience. They said, we don't know what the policies are. And then when you listen to students and you hear that basically they have a different set of rules for each class, and keeping that straight, and then trying to figure out, if I'm sick and have to miss 3 classes in one day, I have to figure out 3 different policies. And we wanted to streamline that, but also think beyond just making it more consistent. Consider, are we overregulating? And so we came up with this idea of wellness days. Of, students may need time for a variety of reasons, and just allow them to have that time. And so the creation was, they have a certain number of sort of no ass days, and we put structure in place so that the students initiate this process, and they can submit these requests. It's documented. Students, instructors can be made aware of it automatically, and they receive notifications. But they can use these days in different classes, and the results were really positive. It took off, and not in a way of, okay, well, we have an absentee problem. Actually, it was more, we had benefits in terms of communication. We had benefits from students, and faculty started to look at these and say, I understand. Faculty would say, I understand my students better. And then, the students, just that little sense of empowerment, said, thank you for just giving me that. I needed this time, and I didn't really want to explain why. And so it's really been promising. Like I said, it's in the early days, but that was one step towards, centering things in the student experience.
I love it. I love it. It's so simple, especially, I mean, especially if you think about us as adults, right? If we need to call out sick, or if we're struggling, our kids are sick, just being able to say, I can't come to work today, but extending that same opportunity to our students, especially, you're right, as they're navigating these policies. I always say we can give our students whiplash, right? Because they're moving from class to class to class to class, and they're trying to figure out what is happening in each class by itself. And so I just love the idea that there is some sort of consistency that's offered to them throughout all of their courses, any courses. And I think that's great, because you're not making the instructors change their policies either, right? A lot of times it's very hard to try to get all the instructors to agree on one set of policies that makes sense for their class. They feel like there's some nuances for their class. And so this is a great way to solve it. I mean, I love this idea.
Yeah, thank you. And then, I can give you an example, because I think one thing that we've thought of through this is that what's, sort of what's critical, important to you at the time is individual. So, a student may, they may need to move, so they need to look for an apartment, and they have a one-time schedule. They have to meet with someone to tour an apartment. Well, that's housing, and that's really important to them. But if they look at the syllabus, and there's no accepted excuse for, I need to go tour an apartment. But at that moment in time, that is the most important thing, because if they don't have a place to stay, school is secondary. So we just erase that need to explain. That's important. You're able to make the judgment that it's important. Take the day.
I love it. How is it tracked?
So we, use an automation system. We use Smart Sheets as a tool, so that the students have dashboards, and the dashboard is available in all their courses. It's the same singular dashboard. It's just one click away, and they can just submit. This is my course. This is what I want to do. And then, then again, trigger some automation so that the student knows that they were received. The instructor knows it was received. They can view their own dashboards to kind of view histories on it and such if they want to. But we really wanted to take sort of the hands-off approach to it as well.
I love it. I think that's beautiful. Um, Something else you talked about was the classroom as an experiment. You talked about that a couple of times. Can you expand on that? What does that actually look like in practice?
Sure. So, when I think of research. We think of sort of the hard sciences, and even creeping into education, where we often think of like trying to prove something. But if you think about a classroom, you can't prove anything because there's too many variables that change every time. You can't really replicate truly that same experience. So when I think of classroom as an experiment, we're not looking to prove, we're looking to learn. And you know if you really frame it that way, it's a little bit more freeing, that I'm going to try this out, I'm going to experiment. Whether it is a success or a failure, I've learned something from it. I take that information and I experiment again. So everything is iterative, and I'm not saying that you have to change, like something works. We don't necessarily have to change everything the next time, but you recognize that it doesn't prove anything. It's just more insight. And we do this naturally as we learn. Um, but taking that mindset and saying that we're going to experiment in the classroom is actually a bit more freeing, and allows you maybe to try things that otherwise you almost overthink of. Oh, I have to make sure that these pieces are in place, and then I need to publish it, or I need to do this. Make a change, note it, think about it, and that's your experiment. And be transparent with it. It's something I always say, like, speak to your students. Here's what we're going to be doing. I'm trying this for the first time. We'll see if this works, and live with it in that small space.
I love it. I especially during COVID would give my faculty a secondary space in the LMS that I called a sandbox. And so they would have their classrooms, but I would give them a sandbox and I would say, this is where you can play. And what I found is that they actually used the sandbox a lot. And I don't know if they were just afraid of doing something in their class and not being able to, walk it back or mess up, or the implications on their class. But that sandbox space, they really latched onto and experimented in the same way. It was kind of mind blowing a little bit.
Yeah, I actually did something similar. We were rolling on an LMS at that time, and those sandbox spaces. Some people, they were kind of pulling them back at one point. They're like, "Can I keep it? Can I just?" He said, "You still need this? Like, I don't need it. I want it."
Yeah, it just creates this like safe little space to experiment. Um, how do you encourage faculty to embrace this idea of experimentation? I think a lot of times we want to get it right and we want to produce the best possible thing the first time, right? So, how do you really help faculty embrace this idea of experimentation?
So it's twofold. One is to think small. Don't think in terms of changing an entire course and doing upheaval. Think about aspects of the course, or sequences, units, lessons, etc. But also, it's sort of a backwards design where I can start with talking to faculty and just have a conversation of, like, what is the experience that you would like in class? What is the ideal experience for your students? That the part where you just sit there and say, "This is why I do this. This would be ideal." Start there, and then say, "Well, what are some of the actions and behaviors that could get us there?" And not talk about like reality and logistics and anything like that. Just talk from there. And once you kind of have those pieces in place, then say, well, what could we do to what you currently are employing to maybe get there? Let's make a change. But when you start with the goal, and the goal is just that this is what I want my students to experience in a very positive way, it kind of takes away those concerns, or maybe this, we're experimenting to fix a problem. Instead, we're experimenting to get to somewhere we really want to be.
Yeah, I love it. And I think for us, this idea of backward design is just secondary knowledge, right? But I think a lot of times people forget that our faculty, they're experts in their domain, right? They're not experts in the domain of teaching and learning. And so a lot of times faculty have never heard of this concept. It's new to them, and all they know is the LMS has quizzes and it has discussions and it has modules, and therefore all of my content must fit into these nice little boxes. But if we flip that and we think about the ideal, a lot of times it's not a quiz, or a lot of times it's just figuring out how can we get the LMS to work for your vision versus the other way around.
Absolutely. And I'm a big cook, and I always think of like cookbooks in this. I always use food analogies that, like, the best cookbooks to me have that, you open to a page, and the first page is like a gorgeous full color of what the finished product is, and the next page is the recipe. And imagine if you're going into it and you don't see what you're making, you don't even see a title for it, and you just follow the recipe and you don't know what you get at the end. I mean, the cookbook's backwards design. You see it with your eyes, you know what you want to achieve, and then you start working through the recipe on it.
That's such a good that's a good, analogy there. Okay. So we kind of skipped over your new role. I jumped into kind of some of my favorite things that you've talked about. Um, so let's talk about that a little bit more. I really want to sit here because I think using data to inform improvement is something that people really want to do. And I think a lot of people say we collect data and then it kind of stops there, right? Like we collect it, but we know collecting is not the same as using it. But I think a lot of it's they just don't know where to start, right? They have all this data. Where do you start? So you've been digging into it in new and interesting ways. Where do you start and what are the first steps in identifying those meaningful insights?
Yeah, and so part of what the role I'm in, where I'm not maybe in one course but looking at many courses at once, I just had to acknowledge the fact that because I'm just not so intimately involved with each class or each student, I need to use data to help better understand the overall experience before I can go in and ask other questions. So it started by looking at found data. What data are we collecting? And often, like somewhat unintentionally, there's different systems have data, but you can, when you look at it from both qualitative and quantitative, you can find data, even if it's just data of like how many chairs are pulled out in a room. You're like, okay, well, that's how many students were active that day. You can look at data in different ways. Um, and so where I begin with it is not looking at a data set with a problem in mind, not going to the data set to find sort of confirmation or to say, like, I know there's an issue, let me find the issue. It's just to look at these data sets and just circle things that are interesting. Um, and they don't have to be significant. I think so much we look at like, well, I need to get so many instances before I know that there's a trend, and then I can present this and say X number of students are doing this, therefore we have to make a change. I look at it just more like if there's one instance, and I know that it's an outlier, and I know it might be noise, it's a real person, it's a student, it's their lived experience, and I want to know why that happened. I want to know, even if the other 99% did something else, why did this one student go the other direction? And so I'll kind of highlight those. I'll put them on my whiteboard, just leave them there, and ask just questions. And I'm just curious about those different experiences that maybe push against the expectation. Um, Noting that they're all just as important. We don't need a volume to make it sizable. And if it's a concern and it concerning data, well, if we can address it for that one student, we've made an improvement. And if it's something beneficial, what can we learn from it to help with the next one? We don't need to make huge gains, but just small adjustments. And I think that looking at data that way can allow us to make those kind of initiatives and actions.
I think we're best friends, Michael. I think we're best friends. I always say if you go into research with an idea in your mind, we can make the data say anything, right? If
Yes.
if we have preconceived notions that students are going to think X, Y, and Z, we can make the data tell that exact story for us. Same thing with the students, just if it happened to one student and it was bad and we can prevent it from happening to any more students, then that's one is enough. And I think when we look at data, a lot of times, like you said, we want multiple. We want more than 10, more than 20, more than 30, right? But you're right. One is enough, especially if it was something bad and we can correct it pretty easily. Then why would we want any more than one student to have to experience that?
For sure. And I can share an example. Going back to this wellness initiative, data started coming in. Um, from a variety of classes, data was coming in fast, and just looking at it early, just kind of glancing at this data set, um, looking what stood out, and what I noticed was, or asked questions, was like, this data doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's outside environments of phenomena happening. So if three students put in a wellness day on the same day in the same class, what I started to ask questions on was like, what else is happening then? Is it something in their course, in other courses? Is it something external? Is it weather related as we're having right now? Is it political? Is it cultural? There could be other factors in, and so I started to like look at that, like just looking at like our university calendar, looking at other components, looking at the other courses, and just saying, wonder what might cause this. And those that was data we never had before because it kind of like just stayed in those conversations between individuals and not looking at it in a way of, okay, this is punitive and we need to fix this problem. It was looking at it saying, can we support students here? Is there something that could be done differently to support them, or is this just something that we can help better our curriculum and our structure with? I'm hoping to take some of this to say, if we find that, for example, students are taking a wellness day and you realize that in a different class they are there and they
Mm.
all have an exam in that class, well, they're taking this one off, they might be taking it to prepare for that exam. What can we do in terms of our sequencing and our balance and our opportunities for students so that they can succeed in both? And that's a change we can make on the back end, that helps everyone.
I love that because I think a lot of people would stop with the wellness days. They would be like, well, we give them these wellness days. Now they can burn them. You are kind of upping the ante and you're saying you have your wellness days. Yes. But we could also use that data to inform institutional practices, scaffolding the program map itself, right? You're using that also as a data point to inform changes. What other data are you utilizing?
So other data that we're getting, say you have data from the LMS, to ask certain questions from, um, also just qualitative, collecting from students, asking things that way. Um, and some of this is more emergent as we start to. It's almost like once you have one system in place, you start to learn, okay, where else can we collect data? What other questions we have? So those are becoming places that we can start to say like, okay, we have this data. Is it informing changes? And so a lot of that's still like early on, but it's kind of keeping that in mind. And anything that we're starting to do as a program is, you know, what can we learn from it if we're going to institute anything?
Um, how do you so there's a human aspect of teaching and learning, right? So data, human aspect. How do you balance those data-driven decisions while also balancing the human aspects of teaching and learning?
I think it's a matter of being curious about the data. Don't actually make decisions based on the data. Like, the, we're not trying to prove anything. Kind of going back to that, we're just saying this is occurring. We see this. This is the truth. It's there, but it does not mean you have to react. It does not mean that you have to do that. And bringing it back, if I have this one data point, it tells a very narrow story, and I'm hypothesizing on it. But if you talk to those who are directly involved and they know all the other aspects to it, they may explain it in a different way, and I usually accept that. That's canon. That's okay. You've contextualized. Uh, we keep that data. We look at it. If it returns from semester to semester, we see things. So you're not explaining away the data, but again, don't make decisions on it just with data alone, because it is that human aspect that's going to understand it more.
I love that. I think a lot of times we don't look at data this way. We look at data, we pull the qualitative, the quantitative, and we're like, okay, based on this, we're going to make 10 changes. We're just going to hop in and then we can tell our accreditor, look at this is what we found. This is what we changed. We're good. We solved it. And so I love this idea of just being curious and not always feeling the need to act on it immediately, right? To see the story more, to dig in, to let it sit there. I think that kind of goes against a natural, I don't know, like, inclination in us to wanna solve problems. And so I love that you just are like, "Hey, it's here. We're gonna put a pin in it. It's there. It's somewhere in this picture, and we're gonna let it see if it gets bigger or if it materializes into anything else before we reinvent the wheel trying to solve this," right?
Yeah, absolutely.
This is really cool. Your job is super cool. Uh,
I agree. I've been very fortunate, and like you said, when you were talking about it, I had the same reaction where it's like, this is what I've always wanted to do. I mean, we always want the time to dive in and kind of the concepts that are in a lot of the like curriculum development and instructional textbooks that you just like, well, that doesn't work in practice. I have had those affordances to kind of dig into it. So privileged in that regard.
I love too that it's programmatic. I think sometimes if we go, like, to the institutional research level, right, the IR level, we're looking at data across the entire institution, and I'm a big believer that programs have nuances. They have to, right? We can't treat our education students the same as which we would teach we can't they're not the same as human sciences or our nursing students or our marketing students. And so I think at the institutional research level, sometimes we can get too macro and try to make decisions or combine data across the entire subset of students or the entire population of students, not subset. So the idea of narrowing it down in a programmatic way also makes really good sense to me.
Absolutely, and it's just having the conversation recently that looking at our data at a program level, like I said, I agree with you, like it's going to be most telling because there's not those other variances we just can't account for. But now that we're collecting this data, any data that we can compare it to the institutional data, and just say like, is ours different than the mass? Is there, or is it the same? And said not making rash changes on it, but if that data set exists, I'd love to just take a look at it to see if there's any differences there, and are we making a difference? What can we do to maybe help inform other programs?
That's cool too. Yep, I like that. All right, we're gonna switch here because another topic that you had talked about when we spoke was this idea of equity, and something you're working towards is this idea of equity across online and in-person learning. So, in this context, how do you define equity when you're comparing about online versus on ground?
Sure. And this is, I've done a bit of research and work in this area in terms of course design and course experience. And as I said, starting with that student experience. Um, so when I think of equity here, I actually don't think of equity in terms of the experiences in the class or the class activities, assignments. I actually just look at like learning outcomes and what you want students to feel, to know, to be aware of at the end. What are you trying to achieve? How they get there doesn't actually need to be equitable, I think, with the two modalities. If one modality requires more assignments or different assignments, more activities, longer time to get to the same goal, then let that be. And that, yes, for instructor sanity, sometimes we want to make sure things are aligned where they can be, but giving space to say, this isn't going to work in both ways, not the way we want to achieve it. Let's not force it there and then be unhappy with the results. Let's go ahead and make this difference. We'll get back to it when we get to those big learning outcomes. So it maybe is a departure from sort of consistent course design, but you make those like detours when you need to.
I love that. I think a lot of times when we think about equity, we're thinking that exact same thinking what you described you're not trying to do, right? We're trying to think a person is taking a class online and on ground, and how is their experience, how do we make their experience equitable? You're saying, I think, the knowledge is equitable, that we can ensure that when they are walking away from Psych 101, that they are walking away with very equitable knowledge base. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. Because we can say like, and we do this with some institutions that they give credit for work experience. Sometimes you can get certain courses, right? What you're saying is a person who worked in a field who learned this is achieved all the same learning as someone who's in the class. Those experiences aren't equitable at all. So we do this, and we're just want to do this within these different modalities, and to say it's okay, we're going to get there. No, we're not necessarily treating them as different courses, but we're willing to go that far if we have to.
I think it's wonderful. This kind of leads me to my next question, which is faculty-driven curriculum. I talk to a lot of people all the time. This is a hot topic right now. There's a lot of administrators who want a little bit more control over the curriculum, and there are faculty who are holding on to that, faculty own the curriculum, and it's not a nice it's not a nice little box, right? It's messy. So how are you starting to move this initiative forward, this, faculty-driven curriculum? Talk to me about that.
Yeah, it's a touchy subject and one that I understand, and I've been sort of on both sides of it, so I get why you'd approach it and say, well, I built this, I want to use it in a certain way, and then we're saying, push towards maybe standardization or policy, and there can be pushback. I'm there. The conversations that I have is more on, let's focus on giving faculty the time and the autonomy to do the things that they do best, and that they have the skills and background, sharing their knowledge and experience, especially being in the health sciences. A lot of our faculty come from those fields. Well, you're being able to share what it's like in the field and the workforce is invaluable, cannot be taught in a textbook, cannot be designed. I can't design it or provide it. That's special. Do more of that and less of the curriculum design. And the facilitation, the care, the student connection is, and really say, like, we want to empower you to do as much of that as possible if we can take some of these other things off. Now, there's a balance to it, of course. And so it's having those open channels, but I've found that those conversations have been more positive, and looking at it that way, like, nobody wants to sit and design rubrics and grade except for you and I who design these things. Let's have everyone facilitate and talk and share their experiences.
I love that, because I think right now there's so much fear around faculty, right? Especially if we were to bring this AI topic into the conversation, right? It's instructional designers and SMEs alike. How does AI threaten us? And you hit the nail on the head here with faculty, which is there are things that the instructional designer and AI will just never know, right? Especially industry knowledge, they won't know what water cooler talk is within the break room of a specific organization, right? And here's an example I had from the other day. I don't know if I was telling you about this, was when I worked with surgical tech students, the program director was like, "Hey, make sure when they're going out for interviews, they wear their scrubs, because they might need to scrub in for a working interview." And I thought, wow, I am in career services. I would have put them in professional attire. I asked ChatGPT the same question. I have a surgical tech student. What should they wear at their interview? And the response was they should wear professional clothes. So right there, right? It's like the faculty just has knowledge that we can't find anywhere else. And you're right, do more of that. Do more of that, and that's the value. That's enough. It doesn't need to be more than that.
And I think we know that even just from having the internet now with AI, is that, like, we are no longer the keepers of knowledge, of keeping, students want just the knowledge itself. They can go look it up. We have no control over that. But that context and that color, that's something that is still there and is valuable, and it's what you remember. So I really want to give more space for that.
Absolutely. My husband did an accounting degree, and he had faculty members who would tell him, like, "Hey, this is how you get blackballed from an industry." I saw people get blackballed. He had a faculty member who was blackballed themselves, and he was able to say, "Don't make the same mistakes I did." You can't find that in a textbook.
No.
There's you just won't. Um, so I think conversations like these are really important, just to help our faculty see, like, we're not you you know it. You are the subject matter expert here. You know the exact things our students need to know, but then we're all here supporting you
Mhm.
in that curriculum design piece. Um, what are some of the biggest challenges in ensuring equitable experiences between online and on-ground students? I know we weren't really talking about the experience piece, but do you have any thoughts on this? What are some of those challenges in ensuring equitable experiences?
So the main challenge that I've kind of come to, and one that almost like most disheartening in a way, is lowered expectations by students of that experience. Almost the idea that I'm going to take an online course and it's a less than, it's the B option. And even though we know they're very popular and there's a growth in that area, but there's still this idea that it's not the same. I'm just accepting a lower quality product, and I'm accepting that I may not learn things as well, and that's really limiting when I talk about this idea of designing from where we want people to learn and what they want to achieve and what the knowledge ideas are. If that's where that disparity is, if the online students already say I'm going to learn less and I'm going to be less, we won't have equity. And that's been hard because it's one thing to sort of convince one instructor of this idea and move forward with it, but when you bring this to the students in the class and they already kind of like, well, this is what I expected to be at. I want to change that mindset, but it's difficult, and so that's been a challenge. And I'm not saying I have all the answers there, but it's certainly something to be aware of, that they don't always go in with the same idea, and that's unfortunate.
I think that's such a good point. I think too, there's a perception of ease, right? That online is probably easier. Um, I love on ground classes so much. I love online learning. I really do. But as a student, the nerd in me, there is nothing like sitting in a class, opening up your notebook, interacting. And that's really hard to replicate online. Like,
For sure.
ha- as much as I love online learning, there's just something about that classroom experience that I haven't been able to replicate exactly in an online environment.
Yeah, and I think that it's also we're painting with very broad brushstrokes here, in that is every course and every curriculum and topic best designed for online? It isn't. But you can say the same thing for in person. There's some courses and programs that are probably just better on online, and not equitable better,
Totally.
because sitting in a room, maybe being lectured to, it's not as effective. We always tend to talk about our best experiences in person. We don't talk about the worst ones. So that kind of goes back to that mind. Talk about our bad online experiences, and we talk about our good in person experiences. Flip that a bit, and the conversation is a little bit more balanced.
I totally agree. I think too, something I've always thought of is like, why do all classes have to be the same length? If
Yes.
there are topics that we can go through faster, why can't we go through them faster? Why can't we do it in, 5 weeks versus drawing it out to 15 weeks? Um, Kind of the same concept there too, right? Like, will there ever be a time in which we say, these are your 5-week classes. You can take 3 of them within your semester, and these are the classes that we think are best at 15 weeks, and these are the classes that we think are best at 5 weeks.
For sure. And I think that goes back to, I said, so where my beginnings were, it was being an elective teacher where we didn't really have state tests and state requirements. And I was kind of said, go ahead and build your curriculum. And I didn't know what I was doing. And so I taught something for as long as it needed to be taught. And it wasn't even like 3 days or 3 class days. Sometimes it was 2 class days and 10 minutes of the next one. And then we just rolled into the next lesson. And I built it that way. And I was said, okay, well, that's how much time we need. It was only until I got out of that I realized that the rest of the education world didn't operate that way, and I'm still kind of reconciling with that fact. But I carry with it that how much time do we need to go over something? Give it that much time.
Absolutely. Because if you give a faculty 3 hours, they're gonna fill that 3 hours, right? And they're not gonna be like, "I actually only need 10 minutes for this, so class, you can leave." It's gonna be like, "Oh, I have 3 hours, I need to fill the 3 hours. I have 15 weeks, I need to fill the 15 weeks." And I think that's where we start to see things like the use of busy work, in our evaluations and things like that, is if we're trying to just fill a class for the sake of filling time, then we risk busy work or at least a perception of busy work.
And that's where you can see that advantage of online because in person, well, there's scheduling, there's rooms. You can't just take a room longer than you need to. I get that. Space is at a premium. Well, not so much in an online space. So you could start end classes as much as you wanted. You have that open space to operate. So we could break down some of those walls.
Totally. I was in an online class a couple weeks ago, and it was just really low energy. And my teacher was like, all right, I can see that something is going on. We're not even going to try. You have your readings. Bye. Like, that was it. I think we were 15 minutes into class. She's like, I can just tell that I don't know if it's, what it is, but there is something. And I think mentally, you guys are all elsewhere, and that's fine. So goodbye. I'll see you next week. And I was just
Yeah,
like,
I'm sure that was really empowering just to say, you know what, we probably did need that.
totally, totally. Because then what I did is I was like, I had a paper due. And so I'm like, my mind is on this paper that's due in a couple of days and how much I haven't done with it. And so I was able to then take that time and finish my paper. And I was like, oh, thank you, sweet teacher.
And that's the exact student experience that I'm trying to hold with the work I do is to think about those ideas and to understand that each student is a person,
Totally.
and we can recognize that and make adjustments as needed.
Absolutely. That kind of actually leads me to my next question, which is what's next for your work in using data to improve student experience? What comes next?
Um, I think it's creating more space for student dialogues. There said I don't want to make decisions off of the data, but I do want to understand more. And we've had some spaces, but to have more of those conversations to kind of see if these experiments bear repeating, expanding, things like that. So not to go too fast, but to make sure that any sort of things that we're learning from it are really benefiting students. So I'd like to almost take a step back while still kind of doing so many things, and make sure that we're not missing anything on that qualitative standpoint.
Absolutely. Um, do your students, have you ever looked, are they on Reddit?
I have not looked. I'm sure they are though.
I have a weird fascination with Reddit. It's really bizarre. I love to look on Reddit. And I have never commented on Reddit. I've never left one comment. I just am like a looky-loo. And so I like to see it. The student, you can do like r backslash the school name. And it's always fascinating, like which schools have large communities, which schools don't. I'm always like, why? Why do these schools seem the same? Why is there bigger presence here? I'm fascinated with the schools that have like 1,000 new posts every day by their students. Fascinated. Like you have students who are posting things every single day. So I'd be curious. You should look to see if your students are there.
No, that's a found data set. Those are those great things. Again, not to make a decision from it, but there's truth in what's being said, and it's interesting, and the intention behind it, and not trying to have a response to each item. You don't want to get in that involved, but if it's there, it's someone's truth, and we should consider it. So no, I appreciate that. I'll have to dig into that.
Yeah, I hope you find stuff because it's like I feel like I'm sitting down with a book sometimes. I open my iPad and I'm like, oh, what are they saying today? And then there's bigger ones like student complaints. Those are fun, right? That's like, what are the students complaining about today? Oh, today they hate McGraw-Hill. They hate, they hate the Pearson Connects, right? They hate, it's just fun to see like, what are they so upset about today?
And it's the information you'll never get out of a survey. If you said like, rate your textbook and it's a Likert scale question, you got nothing out of it. You went there and you're going to get far more valuable information.
Totally, totally. Like I always see a lot of students talking about proctored exams and they hate it. And what I'd never found in any of our institutional surveys was that students felt like it was a breach of privacy having someone watching them, looking at their background, having to scan the room. That never came up in our institutional surveys ever as like them not liking proctored exams or a reason why. And on Reddit, that's like overwhelmingly it's the invasion of privacy.
See that?
It's so interesting. Yeah, go look tonight. It's good stuff. It's like a soap opera. Okay, we are wrapping up. So, any final thoughts or insights you'd like to share with educators who are wanting to use data to transform their curriculum? We've already given them a lot, but any last thoughts?
Just kind of embrace your sense of wonder. Just, that we're in education because we like to learn. It's sort of a nerd at heart thing. So, see data, see those found things, go to Reddit, and just, let your imagination run a little bit. Write things down. Just, it doesn't have to be validated. It doesn't have to be formalized. Have that sense of, I just wonder why this is happening. What could it mean? Um, I think there's some joy in that, and it can kind of restore that with all the kind of, you know, structure we almost are overburdened with in education. So that would be really what my advice would be.
Awesome. Great advice. You've given so much tips, Michael, and just a lot of really good food for thought. Again, I feel like we're very like-minded on a lot of these topics, and so it's good to just hear someone else who's in the same camp as me as, one student is enough. Um, so thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge. And I can't wait. Maybe in like a year or so, you can come back and you can, if your university lets you explain, like, what does this process look like now? How has it changed? Has it turned into a bigger university initiative? What changes have been made? I would love to just know, this is designed so carefully. A year from now, what does it look like?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I guarantee it'll look different.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here, Michael.
Thank you. I appreciate it.